Okay, well, welcome everybody. Gives me great pleasure today to bring you a webinar from IOGHG and Chevron on a review of COP26 outcomes. It's 19 days since the COP finished in the late hours on that Saturday, and people have had time to look at the details. And we are very fortunate to have today Arthur Lee from Chevron, who was going to provide his insights as somebody who's very much involved in the COPs. So just before we hand over to Arthur, I do need to show our disclaimer slide as IOGHG. We're a technology collaboration program set up by the International Energy Agency, but we are autonomous from the International Energy Agency, so anything we say does not necessarily count as their views. And this is just one slide for those of you who aren't familiar with us. These are the sorts of things we do as an international research program into the development and deployment of CCUS technologies, producing technical reports, running international expert networks. The main conference on CCUS is the GHGT series, and we've just finished the GHGT 15 and all the papers are online from that. And we're starting with GHGT 16 already, and the call for abstracts is open. So you're very well invited to submit abstracts of your work. And the deadline for that is 14th of January. And the actual date of the conference is there in October 2022. And we've also just had our fully virtual PCC 6 conference last month as well. That's a summary of what we do, and we do all of that thanks very much to our 36 member countries and companies. And Chevron is one of our member companies. And Arthur Lee is a Chevron Fellow and Senior Strategy Advisor at Chevron. Arthur is actually, I think, the longest standing member in IOGHG's Executive Committee, our EXCO. So thanks very much for that. He also serves on the board of IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association. Formerly, he was with EPA, and he has attended very many COPs. And one of the special things about Arthur is that he does follow in detail in the COPs, the negotiations, in particularly on technology and more recently on Article 6. So he's in the room with the negotiators following the developments. And so we get a particularly unique perspective, I think, from Arthur. So with that brief introduction to you, Arthur, I'd like to hand over to you to screen share and take us through your assessment of COP26 outcomes.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. And now I think I'm showing my screen. And let me put this on full screen mode. Can you see, Tim?
Yes,
can you see?
I can see that, and it's full screen mode.
Okay, thank you. Oops, let me go.
Over to you.
Oh, I lost my slides. Sorry. I'm not sure how to get it back now.
Okay. We can still see your slide, certainly.
I cannot see it now. I cannot see my own slide. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Tom, can you take away my control first? Sorry.
So would you like Tom to run the slides for you, Arthur?
Yes, I think that would be best because somehow I lost control. I cannot see slides.
So Tom, can you? Tom, have you got the screen shared from yourself?
Yep, just bear with me, just opening up the presentation.
And so we're banking on about 35 minutes, Arthur, to present.
Yeah. Okay.
And then we'll take about hopefully 20 minutes worth of questions.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Tim, for that reminder. Okay. Thanks very much, Tom. Don't know
can
what
see that
happened.
now, yeah?
I was all prepared. Yeah, I can see the slides. I was all prepared
Okay, great.
to try my own slides. So thank you. Let me just stay on this slide just for a moment. As Tim said, I've been to these COPs many times. I started at COP 5 in Bonn. Okay, I still recall to this day how COP 5 Bonn, we could fit all of COP, almost all of COP into one hotel. It was the Maritime Hotel in Bonn, and also several large conference rooms in the at that time some of the German ministry buildings, when the German government hasn't yet moved most of its ministries to Berlin. So this was in 1999, COP 5 Bonn. So anyway, now the COPs are COP26 was, as far as I know, was about 37,000 officially registered over the course of 2 weeks, and it certainly felt like it. The way that the corridors and the rooms that were all configured, it was very tight. Lots of people, and Tim can describe some of his feelings too. Walking through the corridors, and it was very crowded. And it was good that the UK government, Scottish government as well, instituted certain policies for COVID-19, and was testing every day, certainly, and also mask, of course, wearing that indoors. So it was very important to do that. And also, in the first week, the first 3 days or 4 days, the UN Secretariat actually stopped people from coming in. And the second week also, in the first 2-3 days, also stopped people from coming in. They instituted an emergency protocol to prohibit anyone further from coming into the venue until people start leaving. So anyway, that gives you hopefully a sense of what that is. It was certainly one of the most interesting COP I have ever been in since COP 5 in 1999. So next slide, please. Right here. Yes, thank you. I think I think it wouldn't be too much of an exaggeration to say that the COP26 was a success in my view. Okay, yes, there were some decisions that were simply not made and failed to reach agreement, and so there will continuing to be great controversies over certain issues, and I'll describe those. But certainly from my perspective, and others will disagree, other experts and other observers who've been to COP many times as well, they may have different assessments. In fact, I've been going to some of these kind of webinars like this one to listen to others, listen to their views as well. And when I formed these views right at November 13th, actually, I made up the slide deck. That was the day of the closing plenaries. So when I made up this slide deck, these are my views, and these views haven't changed too much, even after listening to others, because I think since I have firsthand knowledge, I think I can say certain things that perhaps others haven't seen. One of the things I want to get your minds all wrapped around on is that each presidency for the last decade now likes to name the package of decisions, give it a name. So the UK presidency was no exception. They named this the Glasgow Climate Pact. Okay? You would ask yourself, well, what is that? Well, what does that mean? So I'll give you a bit of a background on what all this means. Obviously, you have the COP. COP is the Conference of Parties. That has to do with the annual meeting of the United Nations Conference. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. So that's what that is. A COP is the annual meeting for parties to the convention to meet and help refresh and implement the UNFCCC, which is the mother treaty that was agreed to in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, and which came into force as international law in 1994. Okay, so that's the COP, and now it's at the 26th round, COP26. Now, a few years later, you would also have the Kyoto Protocol, and that was agreed to, and that's a legal treaty. Okay, so again, it's a protocol that derives from the UNFCCC, and the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, serving as the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, that itself has an acronym. It's called CMP. So you may have heard that over the years, but in any case, it's CMP, as distinguished from the COP. Okay, and this difference was actually important for several years because the United States was never a party to the Kyoto Protocol. So the United States rarely participated in any of the meetings that are or sessions that are labeled as CMP. Okay. And then thirdly, now after 2015, you have the Paris Agreement. So now the difference between the COP and the Paris Agreement now is actually small, in the sense that almost all the parties now in the Paris Agreement are the same as the ones that agreed to the COP, to the UNFCCC. So the meeting, the party serving as the meeting of the parties of the Paris Agreement also has an acronym. It's called CMA. Okay? I'm giving you all this minutia. I hope it's interesting to you. It's because when you hear things in the media and you hear things like the Glasgow Climate Pact, you might think, oh, is that another legal treaty? What is that? Actually, that's all it is perhaps the human being's desire to name everything. And the UK presidency named the package of decisions that were made the Glasgow Climate Pact. Okay, so next slide. So there are 5 themes in the Glasgow Climate Pact, 5 themes in the package of decisions that were made. Okay. First theme is scaling up mitigation is critical this decade. I think you would probably all of you would be very aware of what the IPCC has set out in its August report. That report was, of course, the first report of the Working Group 1 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on the science. And it's very clear the science is telling us some urgent messages around the intensification of climate change effects. Okay, there will be a second report that will come out in February of 2022 that will focus on impacts and adaptation, and a third report in which I'm also involved in as a review editor of Chapter 6 of Energy, of the Energy Systems Chapter. Working Group 3 will come out with their report in March. So the IPCC collectively, the messages, I can't talk about Working Group 2 or 3 at this point. It's not released yet, but Working Group 1 is very clear. Impacts are intensifying, and so scaling up ambition and mitigation and also adaptation is critical this decade. Okay. Long-term finance is another key issue that was talked about, and to some degree there was a set of decisions that were made around long-term finance. It's not all good news. And it's not all bad news, but it's certainly including adaptation finance. It's very clear that it is not enough and needs to increase. So that was a second message. And this is an important one because this long-term finance, the $100 billion goal that's been talked about since Paris, when that decision was made, the $100 billion per year, okay, this is a per year goal, that would be achieved by 2020. To the years 2025, that goal has not been achieved. As far as we can tell, as the parties themselves can tell, the OECD did an analysis that there were roughly $79.8 billion, say $80 billion for round numbers, that had been achieved, but that's it. They never reached the $100 billion goal. Okay, so the third theme. Technology mechanism needs collaboration and sustained resources. This is the track I have been following more closely in the recent years, as Tim mentioned. So technology mechanism is something that was provided for under It was actually operationalized in COP16, COP16 Cancun. Okay, and so at COP16, technology is something that that's clearly one of the key processes in whole energy transition. And this technology mechanism, even though it's been operationalized, it's never really had a formal linkage to the financial mechanism part of the UN Framework Convention. And so the kind of resources that it's had has been a fairly small budget of a few $1 million, okay, over 5 years. The first 5 years, I recall, when I started observing their meetings, I recall it was a $5 million budget. Okay, that was to be spent in about 5 years. So it was a very small budget, basically to help developing countries to do technology needs assessments at their request. Okay, so this would help them to decide what they could do under their national circumstances in terms of energy transition. But that's it. So there's no more money after that to do much of anything else. Okay? And then Article 6 implementation details are finally largely completed. I'll go into detail of that some more. Article 6 was never agreed to after the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015. It took several years, and certainly in COP24 Katowice, at COP24 it failed to reach agreement while the rest of the Paris rulebook got completed, but Article 6 failed. And then again at COP25 Madrid, it failed again to reach agreement on the details until now. Okay, so I'll go into some of those details now. It's largely completed, and I think there are a few details that still need to be worked, but those few details will not stop the growth and the expansion of Article 6 carbon markets. Okay, that's my view. Okay. Fifth one is also very important because it does tie back to Article 6 as well as to the fundamental architecture of the Paris Agreement. As you all know, the Paris Agreement is made up of the core is the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Okay, so transparency is very important for countries to report their actions, also any financial flows in which they might be donating to others, also what they're receiving from others to help them achieve these nationally determined contributions. So a transparency framework, you may be surprised by this, in that for the longest time since Paris, since 2015, there's no common data elements required, no common tables, no common formats. So there's been all sorts of NDCs are expressed in different time horizons and in different ways of baselines and all that. So it's been very difficult for most analysts to actually compare and analyze these NDCs from 180 plus countries. Okay. So now we have common time frames and common tables. So anyway, next slide, please. Okay, throughout this slide deck, I'll try to touch very briefly on some photos. These photos, the credits all go to the UN Framework Convention, UNFCCC, their webcast. Okay, so on the very last day, I watched this. This actually is the penultimate plenary. I think the COP president, Alok Sharma, the Minister of Climate Change for the UK government, did not really anticipate so many interventions. He thought that he would get more interventions during the closing plenary, but in the informal last stock-taking plenary, he actually got all the interventions in. And the first country representing Group 77 in China was Guinea. So Guinea, the chair of the Group 77 in China this round, when they spoke up, they basically, right at that moment, caused a lot of tension in the room because they thought that the package of text was still not balanced. even though they agreed finally and the late House accepted, they did express the key displeasure that the group has about the phrase phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, and also the coal phase out in paragraph 36 of the CMA3 decision. Okay, so I just want to be clear. This, even though yes, we have agreement now, there was a lot of angst at the very end, and you can even watch it live on webcast. I'm not sure that that everyone was aware of this. It's not in the recordings now, but it was. I watched it live, and you can see several of the key blocks of negotiating blocks, including G7 and China, were consulted by different people, and I could see the UN camera following John Kerry, who's the basically the Minister of State for the U.S. on climate change issues, because he reports directly to the president. He walked around and actually consulted with the various blocks, and certainly one of the biggest angst that was caused at the final hour was this phase out language. So next slide, please. And here it is. That paragraph 36 is now changed to, instead of phase out, it's now phase down of unabated coal power, and retain the words phase out for inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now we don't exactly know what inefficient fossil fuel subsidies actually mean, so this could become a bit of an artful kind of diplomatic compromise between countries. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, just a few further words on this. Now, there were side agreements too at the COP, as I should have mentioned early on. In the first week, the first 2 days, there are usually 2 days reserved at all the COP negotiations, usually in the second week for the high-level segment, what's called the HLS or high-level segment. This time around, because the G20 countries were meeting and hosted by Italy, and Italy is actually considered a partner in setting up and hosting the COP26. So Italy, the Italian Prime Minister, was the host formally for the G20 meeting that took place in the weekend immediately before the start of COP26. So COP26, the first 2 days were converted. The high-level segment were converted literally into something called the World Leader Summit, or WLS. Okay, so the World Leader Summit featured, as many of the world leaders. The only two most prominent leaders who did not come to the meeting were Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, president of China. So many of the countries, especially G20, of course, were there. And so there were side agreements that were announced at the COP, and these side agreements including a methane pledge, including a deforestation, cessation of deforestation. So those were some of the two major agreements, and there were also some sort of finance agreements from finance sectors. And anyone who has some big announcements to make oftentimes use these COP meetings as a backdrop to make their agreements and announce them at press events and all that. But the point I want to make here is they have very little to do with the actual negotiation process. Okay, they have very little to do with them, with a few exceptions. Okay, perhaps with a few exceptions. Okay. And this is historical as well. In 2009, at that time, the first year of President Obama, he established some good rapport with China's president at that time, Wen Jiabao actually, and made some agreements on the Montreal Protocol, at least one agreement, before COP15 at the time. So by doing so, it kind of set up a positive attitude, positive momentum going into Copenhagen, COP15 Copenhagen. Although, as history shows, COP15 actually failed and failed to achieve anything comprehensive. But fast forwarding to now, during the COP event, the 2 weeks, the U.S. and China actually announced a side deal, a side agreement, I think on November 10th, sometime early in the second week. In this side deal, they actually talked about phase out, phase down, and all that, and also agreed to work with each other on a whole range of topics. So this side agreement did lend some positive momentum in the second week. Okay, and it was in this side agreement that I noted that China will phase down coal consumption during their 15th five-year plan. So this phrase "phase down" was used in the U.S.-China agreement, and when I watched John Kerry going around, especially talking to his China counterpart, I could see that the Chinese delegate were quite adamant about something. Okay, I mean, obviously I couldn't hear anything, but was quite adamant about something. And I think, as it turns out, it was probably around this phrase "phase down," because China would not accept anything else if not this phrase, because they already made this side agreement with the United States about phase down coal consumption. So they would not use the phrase phase out. So next slide, please. Okay, so I said mitigation needs to be scaled up this decade. So when you read words like establish a work program, over the years I've learned phrases that actually mean something. When countries agree to disagree with each other, they would normally agree to work on it. Okay, so that would kick the can down the road to the next COP or the next procedural meeting. So when they say that a work program, that means they agree to disagree. Okay, I just want to highlight that here. Yes, it's positive. It's still positive. It means that they at least will move forward and work on something. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, just more photos. Tuvalu, the head of the delegation, basically talked about the future for his grandchildren. Tuvalu, of course, is one of the small island developing states. India said no to the phrase phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, and he made a very impassioned speech that talked about how fossil fuel subsidies for LPG, for liquefied petroleum gas, for LPG used by the poor is something that he thinks is certainly efficient and certainly helps with societal needs. So he made that very strong pitch. But at the end, I think he still accepted the language. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, adaptation finance. As I said before, long-term finance is something that is still a very controversial topic. So in this particular case, in the Glasgow Climate Pact, there was a decision made that urges developed country parties to at least double climate finance for adaptation to the developing world from 2019 levels by the year 2025. So that is called upon by urging. So the word urge has a certain diplomatic meaning. Now the private sector too is called upon to enhance finance mobilization also. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so this is what I said earlier. I won't belabor the point. Deep regret about long-term finance. That $80 billion I talked about, it's certainly a shortfall from the $100 billion per year. Now, this is an important point for me to say as well, that it was supposed to have been achieved in 2020, and it would then be a kind of a yearly thing to 2025. So now at the next COP, countries now have to prepare to negotiate further a new goal, okay? A new goal that uses $100 billion as the floor now, as the minimum. Okay, so while countries have still not achieved the $100 billion goal, the next time around when they meet, they actually have to talk about $100 billion as the floor. So this will be, I think this will be a very controversial topic next time around at COP27, okay, to say the least. We have a shortfall, you still have a shortfall, and yet we have to consider $100 billion as the floor for financing beyond 2025. This finance, of course, is crucial for many countries in what's called their conditional pledges, their conditional NDCs, that they would only be able to achieve certain level of NDCs, certain emission targets, if they have finance. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I know I'm nearing the end here. Okay, Switzerland basically said that they were not consulted when John Kerry was walking around her bloc, the environmental integrity bloc of countries, were not consulted. So she had no idea about the changes until she saw it at the end. But she still accepted the package. She said she didn't want this obviously for her bloc to stand in the way of progress. Bolivia too accepted the package, but Bolivia, representing themselves and their bloc of countries, continue to make very strong messages, as they have in the past decade now, about carbon colonialism from the more powerful and rich countries. Those were actually his words. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, 6.2. This I'm in the business sector. Okay, I'm one of the business NGO observers. So this is just my point of view, and certainly reflect many points of view from people in the business sector. Okay, bingo, business industry NGO, bingo. Okay, 6.2 provides for countries to work together cooperatively and, in effect, trade emissions. These emissions actually have an acronym called Internationally Transfer Mitigation Outcomes. Now, I say trade emissions. In fact, the language in the 6.2 is actually broader than that. It's also not just greenhouse gas emission, but you can also have non-greenhouse gas metrics as well, non-greenhouse gas in actions in your NDCs that you can also trade. Okay, so how to do that? You have to read through the details of the 6.2 to look at some of the rules for converting. Okay, so there will be rules on converting something that's non-greenhouse gas metrics into some sort of emission metric. Okay, and also this does provide for there's a whole paragraph here that does provide for other international mitigation purposes, or OIMP. And the OIMP is important too, because then this would set up linkages to the international civil aviation sector, ICAO, and also IMO, the International Maritime Organization, to their specialist treaties and agreements. Okay, so that is an important part of the provision. Now, what is most important about this is that 6.2 now has really become a major point of progress, in that all sectors now have to make corresponding adjustments. Now, corresponding adjustment it really means is, if you are an accountant, or if you think like an accountant, perhaps like I do, and certainly my wife, who got me thinking like an accountant years ago when I first started working on emissions accounting, when she told me that accounting is going to be fundamental to this, she's right. And because corresponding adjustment is simply double entry bookkeeping. Okay, and it has to be very robust, and the rules here are fairly robust. So I must congratulate the negotiators for having done a tremendous job in getting this through. So we have now double entry bookkeeping, a basic, very fundamental thing, very transparent thing that all sectors must now do if you are to have an ITMOS. Okay, so next slide, please. And there are lots of details here that I just mentioned already. It could be a single year NDC or multi-year NDC, and there are different ways to account for things, some kind of averaging as well. And I've already mentioned the non-greenhouse gas metrics are also used. So what's a non-greenhouse gas metric? I'll just give you an example. So in some NDCs, for example, I remember reading the one on China, for example. They would have a goal of I forget exactly, but 50 million hectares. I just made up a number. 50 million hectares of increased afforestation. So that could actually be traded if they so choose. If a country that has that so choose to use that as a metric, they can actually trade increase in hectares of forest with another country. But there has to be some sort of emission conversion as well. Okay, so next slide, please. There are a few issues that have to be worked on further at COP27 and beyond, possibly. The issues that are unique to the least developed countries and also the small island development states. Now, what those are will have to be determined, but since COP21 in Paris, those issues have been on the agenda for a while as well, and so Article 6.2 will require those issues to be worked out. And there's also a kind of methodological issues that have to be worked out about a trajectory of emission reductions that have to be seen in these trading clubs between countries of 6.2. So at the technical level, there has to be some further negotiations on what those methodologies might look like. So that would be done at the next COP. Next slide, please. But in 6.2, there's no share of proceeds and what's called and certainly no required contribution to the Adaptation Fund. Those are required in 6.4. Okay, but in 6.2, countries are strongly encouraged to contribute resources, money to the Adaptation Fund, and countries are also urged to what's called deliver an overall mitigation in global emissions. I'll explain that in 6.4. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'll start off with this. 6.4 is just like the Clean Development Mechanism. Tim is very familiar with this, about Clean Development Mechanism. As over the years, we did a lot to try to get the CCS technology into the CDM. So anyway, the CDM is an approach as a part of Article 12 in the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, so I know I'm talking a little bit about ancient history, but Kyoto Protocol Article 12 spell out all the requirements to do a CDM project, sponsored by one country and is hosted by another country, usually a developing country. Actually, it is a developing country. So you can do projects that would reduce emissions in a developing country so that those emission reduction could then be traded back to the sponsoring country, usually an OECD country. So there are crediting periods associated with that, and it's usually a 5-year. It was a CDM. It was a 7-year period, but in this new paragraph 4 mechanism, 6.4 mechanism, it will be a 5-year crediting period with possibility for 2 renewals. So basically, what we in the community call a 5x3 approach for crediting. Or you can opt for a 10-year single period with no possibility for renewal. Okay, so that you have a certain certainty in your credits, but you don't get any more after that. Okay, so you can take your pick in terms of what you like. Now the supervisory body of Article 6.4 is not the same as the CDM, but it will be. I suspect it will be very, very similar in the way it operates. Okay. It's not the same. It's not the same people at this point. But the CDM Executive Board, to which this will be compared to, the CDM Executive Board, those of you who follow would know that it's still operating. Those who don't, surprisingly, it is still has a life and is still operating. So the CDM Executive Board is still there. The supervisory body for 6.4 will, in my guess, my view is it will operate fairly similarly to the CDM Executive Board. So next slide, please. Okay, here's where I talk about share of proceeds and also what's called cancellation to achieve an overall mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. In 6.4, it's very clear that there has to be a share of proceeds that will go towards funding the Adaptation Fund. So any kind of transaction under 6.4, the project, the transaction, you have to give up 5%. It's like a tax, okay? So I'll just call it what it is a tax that will be given to the adaptation fund. Okay. Now in 6.2, as I said, there is no requirement. Countries are urged to do that. Yeah. Okay. And so that's a 5%. So if you if you're 100 tons and you want to really achieve 100 tons, you basically have to do 105 tons essentially. Okay. So that you give up the 5 tons. Now there's also a 2% cancellation that would be encouraged for all transactions. Sorry, it's required for all 6.4 transactions. So if you want to do 100 tons, you basically have to do 107 tons, 5 and 2, so that you can cancel the 2% as well. Okay, so next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have said there is a different crediting period for removal projects, carbon dioxide removal projects, and that is, for example, like forestry projects. That would be a 15-year period. Okay, crediting period of maximum of 15 years, and with a possibility to renew twice. So you could think of it as 15 by 3 period. So that I don't know if I can say it's generous or not generous, but 45 years is at least a viable period for some natural climate solution project. It may be viable as well for for direct air capture, for example, with CCS. So next slide, please. Okay, I talked about this already. Next slide, please. Okay, there are these are details now. Those of us who might be involved in or still developing CDM projects would be able to make sure that your projects, if you still have them and you're still operating them, you have to request that they be transferred over to Article 6.4 by 2023, December 2023, and certainly no later, get approval no later than 31 December 2025. That approval, of course, from the CDM Executive Board. Okay, and any kind of methodology that you're still using in your CDM project can still be used until the earlier of the end of the crediting period that you applied for already, or 31 of December 2025. So there is a transition for these projects from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement, and this was one of the major sticking points that caused Article 6 to fail at COP24 and COP25. Finally, we have a compromise that got this through. So next slide, please. I know I'm kind of I should stop soon, but anyway, I just want to go through this particular detail as well. So if you are a holder or owner of any kind of CDM credits, look at the date. Look at when it was issued. If you bought some credits unwittingly, that was issued before 2013, you're out of luck. Okay, but any issuance of credits after January 1, 2013, they're still good. Okay, but they will have to be labeled as pre-2021, and they'll have to be labeled as such in the market on any registry, I guess, in the future. And they have to be used, and they can be used only towards the achievement of the first nationally determined contribution of any country. Okay, so there is a expiration period for these CDM credits, but the generosity, I was actually surprised by the January 1, 2013 date. It was more stringent during COP24 and COP25. So countries like Brazil, okay, which had been holding strong on their position, I think got a lot of what it wanted. So that's why it also moved. So next slide, please. There is an Article 6.8 that talks about non-market approaches. I'm no expert in any of this, but certainly the decision text was very clear that there will be established some kind of committee called the Glasgow Committee on Non-Market Approaches, and their job, this committee, is to identify, implement a work program. Note the phrase again, work program. Okay, again, parties really didn't have that much time in 6-8, so they agreed to continue to work on this. And adaptation, three areas: adaptation, resilience, sustainability, and the second area is mitigation, and the third area is about clean energy sources. So let's move on. Next slide. Okay, as I said, Brazil accepted the Article 6 compromises happily. I think the way that he appeared and the way he intervened, they were happy to not block any more progress, and certainly ready to even said ready to operationalize Article 6. I think they're very enthusiastic about 6.4 especially. 6.4 and the clean development mechanism historically was a brainchild of the Brazilian delegation. So they're very happy that this has continued in the way they want to shape it. Okay, so Nigeria supported the G77 China statement about phasing out, about the displeasure that they also have with phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, this is, as I said, was a surprise to perhaps a lot of people who don't follow this. The NDCs were actually did not have any common format for several years. Now finally they do, and this whole series of tables were negotiated. Okay, I have to say I cannot even imagine myself doing this, but certainly these negotiators were very hardcore and very good in what they do. They negotiated for several years actually, and also for a couple of weeks here at Glasgow, to finally get all these tables agreed to, all the elements and their format all agreed to. So I just excerpted two of these tables, but the whole series of these have now been agreed to. Okay, so next slide, please. Costa Rica basically accepted the package, even though it was far from perfect. Australia pointed out how one of their favorite issues is about human rights, gender, and indigenous peoples. So this recognition was inserted. They made sure that it was inserted into Article 6, into one of the preambular paragraphs in Article 6. So he was very happy about that. So next slide, please. Okay, common time frames. This is important too. Again, a surprising thing that took 6 years, okay, of negotiation. And I would say 6 years only because I think most likely was because it was very political. And I think the political momentum was just never happened in the previous COP. But at this COP, everything clicked into place. Is that the time horizon now is now 10 years. So each NDC must now spell out a time horizon 10 years. And then when the next COP is submitted in 2025, it will have that 10-year time frame. So a 2025 NDC would be 2035. Okay. So when you submit a new NDC in 2030, then the time horizon is 2040, and so on. Okay. So this was a very simple compromise, but yet it took 6 years. Okay. So next slide, please. Marshall Islands, she talked about her children, future, okay, very impassioned speech. Antigua Barbuda, again said the package was unbalanced, but at the end she still accepted the text. However, she made I think a very strong statement towards the end, is that even though that it could possibly, even if the action can reach 2 degrees, she thinks that 2 degrees is a death sentence, okay, and that the world must aim for 1.5 degrees. Okay, next slide, please. Tanzania supported G77 China statement, also expressed displeasure too with subsidies, about phasing out subsidies. EU, he didn't say much about the package itself. He only talked about what people should think about for someone in the hall that they care about who will be alive in 2030. So next slide, please. Palau, another one of the small island developing states, is concerned that actions may already be too late to help her country. She basically echoed the same sentiment without using the phrase about that sentence as Antigua and Barbuda. Indonesia accepted the package. So next slide, please. Okay, Sandra Hani is a member of the International Chamber of Commerce. I know for this audience there are probably some business folks and government folks, but for us as bingos, BINGOs, we every morning she is the focal point for the bingo community. So every morning at 9 o'clock, basically every morning, at any COPs, we would meet and coordinate about events that happened the day before, what we expect for that day, today, and also we invite some special guests from time to time to address the bingo community. Now there were other groups too, other NGOs that spoke at the closing plenary, but I'll just point out one of great interest to me. Youth delegates basically told people in the hall that one of their strongest and perhaps angriest statements was, "Do not pretend to speak for us," because there were quite a few national delegates who said that talk about the youth and how they're concerned about how active they are. But the youth basically said, "Don't speak for us," and they were generally not happy with the package. Next slide, please. Okay, these are just photos. Just want to show those of you who've never been to a COP to actually show you what it's like in the negotiating room. And this is actually one of the smaller negotiating issues on technology. It's like that. Okay, people do go through page by page, line by line of text, and sometimes even word for word. And when they say they want to go into consultations, that's actually what they do. The two photographs on the bottom, they actually go and talk to each other in their groups or between blocks. Okay. Now I should have explained earlier. The reason why you even have blocks is all because some countries can only send 2 delegates, 3 delegates. They cannot possibly cover 50 to 60 issues at any particular COP meeting. So they depend on the blocks, and that's why the G77 plus China block is one of the largest blocks. They really do depend. The smaller countries depend on these blocks to negotiate for them. So next slide, please. Tim Dixon is in this side event that's hosted by IPICA. IPICA as one of the organizers. I helped to invite several people, including Tim, and Tim was very kind and accepted. Did a wonderful job explaining about CCS and negative emissions. So anyway, just go on to the next slide. More side events. Tim will talk a little bit more about this, but the point about at these COPs is, yes, there's side agreements. I talked about that, and there are all sorts of side events. So when people invite people like me to side events, there are literally hundreds over the 2 weeks. It's hard to choose, and it really depends on your interest. And sometimes it's even harder to know that there are certain side events. You actually have to actively seek them. And this is one of the side events that IAGHE and the University of Texas hosted together. So Tim will talk about this. So next slide, please. Just more photos. I happened to run into one of the directors in the Ministry of Ecology and Environment in China. So listened to his talk and also got a photo op with him. Next slide, please. Oh, I should have said, China did not have an official government pavilion this time. That's why the name on the pavilion is called China Corporate Pavilion. So it was not an officially sponsored pavilion. I went to other side events. Again, many side events, and I had the pleasure of talking to the lead negotiator for Article 6 from Australia and meeting with some of the ministers. and also a governor of Illinois, one of the states in the United States, who was at a side event, and some of the U.S. negotiators, and also some business folks who were at COP as well. These are the chief sustainability officers for some of the major Fortune 500 companies, such as I think HP was there, Ford Motor Company was there. Anyway, so yeah, so those are those women there on the upper right. They're all from the chief sustainability officers from those major companies. Next slide, please. Just some more sense, give you a sense. There's protests outside. There was also protests inside. The protests inside were more orderly because they have to be, okay, and they can be loud, but they cannot be too loud. So the UN security was very tight on that. But outside, yes, there were a lot of protests, and just you never know. As an AIDA Council member, you never know who you will meet at the AIDA Pavilion. Bill Gates showed up one day looking for people who know about carbon pricing and emission trading. So he stopped by the International Emission Trading Association. One of my colleagues, Julie Mulcairn, that's her first COP, that's in the upper right. And also one of my other colleagues, Chevron colleague from Australia, talked about the Gorgon project, a CCS project, perhaps the largest project now in the world. He talked virtually in the Australia pavilion. And just to give you a sense of negotiators, they actually do have to wait around like the rest of us for the room to open up. So next slide, I think, is Tim. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. So this is the last slide, and we do invite questions, please, in the questions box, and we'll try and address those in the last 5 minutes. But Arthur, thank you very much for that detail, particularly on Article 6. And as Arthur said, there are also these side events, which the purpose of these is to try and get the most up-to-date information into proximity of the negotiators and the negotiations. And we were fortunate again to get a UNFCCC side event. There were 1,100 applications for just something over 200 available slots. And with the University of Texas leading on this application, in fact, and with our partners CCSA and the International CCS Knowledge Centre and Bologna, we were successful again, and we delivered it from a studio focusing on decarbonisation of industries. And you can see that we had Jennifer Wilcox from US DOE there as the VIP, and gave a spectrum of updates with a bit of a focus on developing countries. So also congratulations to CO2 Geonet, who also got one of these UNFCCC side events as well. And then the other one there that Arthur has already mentioned, we were able to organise an in-person side event, thanks very much to the generosity of Bologna with their pavilion. And this one we could really focus on doing what's called a South-South transfer of knowledge between developing countries. And we had people there to present on Nigeria, Trinidad and Tobago, Indonesia, on what they're actually doing, and also what the possibilities are in India as well. And we had a full room, and both of these got very good views online as well. I think over 200 for the UNFCCC one, and over 300 views online for the Bologna hosted one. So important to get these. And as I said, the original intention is to reach negotiators. And with our CCS in the Emerging Economies one, organised with the University of Texas again, we really did. And we had VIPs from the Nigerian government change their plans. And we actually had the head of the Department of Climate Change for the Ministry of Environment attend with some colleagues to that event. So it's very important that we do these. We're reaching out, we're helping countries who want to learn about CCS. Whether they can do it in their own countries is my favourite question. And also thanks to others such as Arthur and IPECA and the Global CCS Institute for inviting us to speak in their events as well about different aspects where we can draw upon the technical programme of IAGHG to add some, hopefully add some value to those as well. So that was just a final mention of what we were mostly involved with there as well. So now, thank you very much, Arthur. Thanks. Can we have some questions, please? And as we wait for any questions to come in, Arthur, I've got a question. So one of the successes for me, and you mentioned, was getting these NDCs updated in 2022. And what we did see in this COP, which was the first for me as well, I think, where we saw this rush of updated NDCs that moved the metric from 2.7 degrees at the end of the century to 2.4 degrees. So not enough, but it's moving in the right direction. But that update in 2022, separately, that separate decision on the common timeframes, that's still referring to updates every 5 years. Do you know which would take precedence, or is the 2022 one just a one-off?
2022 is a one-off. It's really to get people to say that is still my first NDC, and that I'm just revising it. So giving countries, I think, that opportunity to revise rather than say that this is a new NDC. So I think that's how it will be treated. And in fact, some parties spoke up. I didn't quote them at the end there, but some parties did speak up to say that they were concerned that this particular decision almost contravened and reinterpreted the Paris Agreement. So they were actually concerned about that too. But I think in the sense in the room was that this was more of an urging countries to come back with revisions of target, and also some countries simply have not actually still not submitted their NDC. They're
updated ones.
Yeah, they're updated ones, right?
Yes, you're right. I can imagine that at the next COP we may get pressure again in the final outcome text to update NDCs again in 2023, and possibly going forwards like that, which is good. It gives the countries chance to move forward. So
and also the global stocktake is about to occur soon also. So that would really drive that process even more. That's in 2023. So that would really drive countries to say something and to hopefully do something.
Okay. And we have a question on Articles 6.2 and 6.4. Will they promote carbon pricing at various levels?
I think that that question actually it can be very complicated. Okay, so when countries, if it's 6.2, is going to be markets that will be defined for a certain group of countries. It could be even just 2 countries, or it could be several, right? So a market could be developed between a group of countries, and that particular market, whatever infrastructure they use to help to have price transparency or anything like that, and promoting different kinds of projects if they want to, could then establish a different kind of pricing for different emission reduction levels, right? So that could happen. What the question that I've asked is a very interesting one, because it could engender different prices, different kind of drivers for the market. But if a true market develops, then that kind of market 6.2 should have the kind of infrastructure where you can see price transparency. Then I think that kind of pricing would then be, as in any market, will then start seeking out the appropriate price level to clear the market. So that's, in theory, how markets should work. Right?
Okay. Another question is
6.4 will be different, but anyway, go ahead.
Okay. Another question is CCS specific with 6.2, or is it Article 6 in general? Will it impact implementation of CCS, given that CCS projects take longer to develop than other mitigation technologies?
I think that any CCS projects, between countries can work now. In fact, Tim knows this. Some of us are working on potential for countries to get together and in their own NDCs to start adopting some kind of CCS mechanism that would perhaps trade emission reduction that would be very specific to CCS technology. So that could be done, and I think that certainly it might take a little time, but if countries are willing to actually do it, it could take much shorter amount of time to figure out, okay, which countries would have the rules, make sure they have the rules in place to store the CO2, and the kind of reporting, monitoring, verification that would be needed for storage, right, and the capture and any kind of leakage, and then to have the kind of market clearing, market kind of data warehouse that you need, registries, for example, to register these kind of transactions. And once they're transacted, how to correspondingly adjust the CCS credits and different limits and obligations between countries. So certainly, I think it can be built up specifically for CCS and for other project types as well. So it can be done right.
Thanks, Arthur. And to the person who asked that question, it is an area that Arthur's working on through the OGCI, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, looking into this area, and also as IAGHG are also looking into this as well, and speaking to each other and collaborating in this work with different perspectives on that. So watch this space, and in some time we'll be able to give you more of an answer to that question. I think that's all of the questions, and we have gone over time slightly, but I think, as you said, Arthur, it's really no, not at all. We're really grateful for your time and your thoughts and your effort. And as you said, it is a very important COP. It was the first update of the NDCs. It was the first one that really made progress. I've never been in the COP, and my first one was COP5 as well. And I've never been in one where the metrics moved from, well, we're almost in real time during the COP, from 2.7 degrees in this case to 2.4. So, and with all the events going on in there as well, a lot on CDR, just to tell people, as well as the CCS related events that we tried to mention on our website and that Arthur helped organise some of, and as did we. There was also a lot on CDR specifically and the carbon accounting aspects of those. So that's an area of increasing interest as well going forwards.
Yeah.
So,
let me just say one quick thing. These side events are very important, I think, in my view, very educational for many of us, even myself who's been to many COPs, but there's so many issues in the whole climate change space. So a couple of years ago, I think it was the Year of the Ocean, for example. And so going to an ocean side event, you learn quite a bit about issues in the ocean science, for example. So it's so many things that happen at these COPs. So thank you, Tim.
Yeah, it's certainly a very rich environment. And then as well as the science, you throw in all the different interest groups as well, environmental NGOs, trade union NGOs, youth NGOs. And in the same day, I got interviewed by 15-year-old youths formally, and later that day, I got interviewed by Nature magazine. That's the spectrum of interest that you get in the COPs. So it's a very, very rich and very busy environment. And Arthur, you were very busy at this one in long hours every day, and we really appreciate that and your time today sharing your reflections with us. So thank you very much, Arthur, and thanks to everybody who's attended. There will be a recording of this available afterwards, a link through the IAGHG website, and thanks to my colleague Tom Bilcliffe back in the office for running the webinar system. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for listening.